In 2016, a hotel security guard was handed $100,000 in cash.
Yeah.
And his job wasn't to protect a high-profile VIP or, stop a robbery. His job was to make a piece of surveillance tape simply disappear.
Just completely vanish.
Right. So today, we're looking at a massive stack of trial documents, policy analyses, and court transcripts from 2025 and 2026. We're exploring how a billion-dollar music empire functioned less like a record label and, well, more like an organized crime syndicate.
It's a really heavy deep dive today.
It is. But before we get into the mechanics of how a corporation hid this systemic abuse for over a decade, I want to set a very specific ground rule for you as you listen to this deep dive.
Which I think is a vital ground rule, especially considering how these true crime stories are usually consumed by the public.
Absolutely, because
Yeah.
this is not a story about a perpetrator's fame or, their psychology or the spectacle of a fallen billionaire.
Right, no psychoanalyzing here.
Exactly. We are not going to spend time figuring out what made a music mogul tick or marveling at his cunning.
Yeah.
If you are looking for the story of a monster, you're just in the wrong place today. We are here to talk about the immense reality-altering courage of the survivors who dismantled a machine that literally everyone thought was untouchable.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, to do that, we really have to start with the people who actually bore the weight of that machine.
Yeah. So I want to introduce you to Cassandra Ventura, who is known to the world as the R&B singer Cassie. If you're listening to the radio in the mid-2000s, her voice was everywhere.
Oh, absolutely everywhere. She was huge.
She is this incredibly vibrant artist who skyrocketed to fame. On the strength of her sheer talent, she signed a massive 10-album record deal when she was, I think she was just 19 years old.
19, just a teenager.
Yeah. But beyond those Billboard hits, she is just a powerhouse of a human being. Today, she is a mother of 3 beautiful children. She's married to a personal trainer named Alex Fine. And when all of this legal action began to unfold, he put out this incredibly moving statement.
I remember that statement. It was really powerful.
It was. He pointed out that he didn't, save his wife from the situation she survived. He actually said, Cassie saved Cassie. She alone broke free.
Wow.
Yeah. So before we talk about any crimes or any federal trials, we have to center her. Because Cassie's survival and her eventual decision to speak out, it really cracked open this entire ecosystem of silence.
It did, because Cassie's story didn't happen in a vacuum, which really forces us to ask the uncomfortable question, how does a multi-million-dollar corporation manage to hide a reality of ongoing psychological and physical coercion for 10 full years?
Right, because it's never just one person keeping a secret.
Exactly, it wasn't. Ventura's testimony, alongside the incredibly brave accounts of other survivors, like an anonymous woman known in the court documents as Jane, they exposed a vast infrastructure. We are talking about a music executive, Sean Combs, who basically utilized a whole network of staff to hold these women's careers, finances, and personal safety hostage.
Okay, let's unpack this, because reading through these trial documents, I am struck by how mundane the mechanics of the abuse actually were.
The math of the cover-up.
Yes, the actual math. We have that $100,000 paid to the hotel guard to bury the 2016 footage of a violent attack on Ventura. And then we have a $30,000 payout to Ventura's former friend, Carrie Morgan, after Morgan witnessed an assault.
Right.
It's less like a typical criminal enterprise and more like it's like a corporate money laundering scheme. But instead of laundering cash, they're ordering abuse.
That is a staggering way to put it. Abuse laundering.
Yeah, think of it like a modern-day feudal fortress, right? The drawbridge isn't controlled by chains anymore. It's controlled by non-disclosure agreements, a financial leverage, and a small army of complicit staff acting as guards. They keep the victims trapped inside and the truth locked out. So how much of this abuse was essentially corporate-sponsored silencing?
Well, abuse laundering really captures the corporate complicity perfectly. If you look at the source material from the R Street Institute analysis we have here, it breaks down these systemic enablers.
Right, the 70 barriers.
Yeah, they note that there are roughly 70 documented barriers that prevent survivors of sexual violence from coming forward. But 2 of those barriers become virtually insurmountable when you are dealing with this specific kind of wealth.
I saw that huge list in our research stack. Which 2 barriers are you referring to specifically?
Institutional betrayal and the weaponization of civil litigation. Let's look at how an NDA functions in this environment, right? Legally speaking, a non-disclosure agreement cannot prevent you from reporting a felony to law enforcement. That is just a legal fact.
Okay, sure, on paper.
Right, on paper. But in reality, if you are a 22-year-old assistant or a young artist whose entire financial life is controlled by the label, you simply don't have the resources to fight a billionaire's legal team in civil court to prove the NDA is void.
The threat of the litigation alone is enough to bankrupt you?
Exactly. So when the Human Resources Department, the private security detail, and the corporate lawyers are all literally on the payroll of the abuser, who do you report to?
You don't. You're completely trapped. You're in a system where the very people who are supposed to protect you are being paid to silence you.
Yeah.
Which honestly makes the fact that Ventura, Jane, and these other women eventually breached that system even more incredible. Which brings us to the summer of 2025, the federal trial in Manhattan.
Right. Taking the stand against a powerful figure who has systematically controlled your life. I mean, that requires a level of fortitude that most people cannot even fathom.
It's unbelievable. And reading the trial transcripts, they are just heavy. I mean, we saw Cassandra Ventura take the stand for 4 grueling days. We saw Jane testify.
Yeah.
We saw a former assistant, identified as Mia, who described being completely isolated and coerced. We saw the singer Dawn Richard bravely step up to corroborate that atmosphere of violence.
And the retaliation was so severe.
Insanely severe. We even heard from the rapper Kid Cudi, who testified that his car was firebombed in a driveway simply because he dared to date Ventura. The pattern of violence and retaliation was laid out so meticulously. And yet, and this is what we need to talk about, the jury's verdict in July 2025 was incredibly split.
It was a highly complex legal outcome. What's fascinating here is the contrast. The jury acquitted the perpetrator on the overarching charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking. However, they did convict on 2 counts of violating the Mann Act.
Okay, wait, I need to pause here because I'm really struggling with the jury's logic.
A lot of people are.
Let's define these terms for a second. Racketeering, that's the REACO Act, right? The law the federal government basically used to take down the mafia.
That's the one.
So how does that even apply to a music label, and why did the jury acquit on it?
That's a great question. So, ARCO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, isn't just for the mob. It applies when an quote-unquote enterprise is used to commit a pattern of crimes.
Okay.
The prosecution argued that the music empire itself, with all its security guards, fixers, and NDAs, was the corrupt enterprise. But here's the catch. To convict on ARCO, the jury has to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the entire apparatus was operating primarily as a criminal syndicate.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, juries often really struggle to apply RICO to a legitimate, functioning business that is also simultaneously producing actual chart-topping music.
Okay, so they acquit on the corporate conspiracy part. But what about the sex trafficking? I mean, if the jury saw the video footage and they heard the testimonies about a literally firebombed car and forced participation in these multi-day encounters with escorts, how on earth do they acquit on trafficking but convict on the Mann Act? Yeah. It feels like a massive contradiction to me.
It does feel like a contradiction, yeah. And it exposes a massive gap between how the law is written and how human beings actually survive trauma. So the Mann Act simply makes it a federal crime to transport individuals across state lines to engage in prostitution.
Okay.
The jury found sufficient evidence that the executive paid to transport escorts across state lines for these coerced encounters. But sex trafficking requires proving that the participation was induced by force, fraud, or coercion. And this is exactly where the defense strategy exploited a profound misunderstanding of human psychology.
Oh, you're talking about how the defense weaponized the survivor's own text messages, right?
Exactly.
Because I was reading the trial coverage, and the defense lawyers practically built their entire case around showing the jury messages where the victim sounded affectionate, or, pointing out that they didn't run away at the first opportunity. They framed their survival tactics as consent.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this is where we have to talk about the biology of trauma bonding, because when a person is subjected to long-term coercive control, their brain is just constantly flooded with cortisol and adrenaline.
So they aren't thinking normally.
Right. We often hear about the fight or flight response, but trauma experts like Dr. Don Hughes, who actually testified at the trial, they emphasize the fawn response.
Fawn. Like fawning over someone.
Yeah. Exactly. When you cannot fight and you cannot flee, your brain tells you to fawn, to appease your abuser, to placate them, to act affectionately, just to keep the temperature down and, frankly, stay alive.
So what does this all mean for the courtroom? Sending a text message saying, "I miss you," to the person who assaulted you isn't proof of a loving relationship. It's a de-escalation tactic.
Yes.
It's basically a hostage negotiating for their life over a text message.
Exactly. It is a deeply ingrained biological survival mechanism. But because our legal system does not require juries to undergo deep, mandated trauma-informed training, they look at those text messages, they look at the delayed reporting, and they mistakenly interpret those survival tactics as voluntary consent.
That is so frustrating.
It is. They struggle to convict on trafficking because the victim doesn't look like the stereotypical victim who fights back immediately and just never looks back.
If you're listening to this, I really want you to think about what that means. If our legal system requires a perfect victim, someone who does exactly what a jury sitting safely in a courtroom thinks they would do in that situation, then the system is inherently designed to fail victims of long-term coercive control.
Absolutely designed to fail them.
Because the law is looking for a stranger in a dark alley. It does not know how to prosecute the slow, methodical erosion of a person's autonomy over 10 years.
And because of that massive gap in the law, we arrived at the October 2025 sentencing. Because the conviction was limited to just the Mann Act violations, the federal sentencing guidelines were much, much narrower. The perpetrator received 50 months in federal prison, a $500,000 fine, and 5 years of supervised release.
50 months. I mean, if you're thinking 50 months, that's barely over 4 years. People get more time for stealing cars. You are not alone.
Not at all.
The outrage over that sentence brings us right up to the present day, the spring of 2026, because this case is far from over. The aftermath is currently playing out in the appeals courts, and the legal maneuvers the defense is trying to pull off right now are just astounding.
Yeah, the defense is currently in front of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and their core argument is attempting to reframe the nature of the abuse entirely. They are pointing to the fact that the jury acquitted on the sex trafficking charges. So, because of that acquittal, the defense is arguing that the deeply coercive, drug-fueled encounters, which, remember, were frequently recorded, should not be viewed as criminal acts, but rather as consensual adult activity.
Wait. I need to understand the mechanism of this argument. How does a lawyer stand up in federal court and claim that tapes of coerced encounters shouldn't be penalized? Like, what is the actual legal loophole they're trying to thread here?
They're actually attempting a First Amendment defense.
You have got to be kidding me.
No, I'm serious. They're arguing that since the jury didn't legally recognize it as trafficking, the recordings of these events should be classified as amateur pornography.
Oh my God.
And if it's amateur pornography, they argue, then producing and possessing it is protected speech under the First Amendment. Essentially, they are trying to use the constitutional protection of free speech to shield a perpetrator from the consequences of filming abusive encounters.
That is just a stunning manipulation of the law. They are basically saying, because she was physically in the room and didn't run away, which we've already established as a biological trauma response, she's technically an actor in a private film. It is sickening.
It really is.
But, while highly paid lawyers argue about First Amendment loopholes for executives, we really have to look at the reality for the survivors right now, today. Cassie Ventura recently revealed that she has had to uproot her entire life. In 2026, she moved her family out of the New York area entirely because she is living with the ongoing, very real fear of retaliation.
And that fear isn't just paranoia, it's rooted in the very real phenomenon of secondary victimization. The trauma doesn't just magically evaporate when the gavel falls.
Right, the system keeps punishing them.
Exactly. According to the policy papers in our stack, independent content creators and internet sleuths took it upon themselves to dig up and publicly dox the identities of anonymous survivors in this case. Like Jane.
Which is just vile.
It is. They treated these women's real lives and trauma like a true crime puzzle to be solved for social media engagement. Furthermore, when the perpetrator was sent to the Metropolitan Detention Center, reports indicated he actually received a standing ovation from fellow inmates.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained the reverence for power and the trivialization of survivors really is in our culture.
I am looking at all these policy changes being proposed right now, and I can't help but feel a deep sense of frustration. I mean, yes, there is momentum. Legislators are pushing for sweeping bans on using NDAs in cases of sexual violence.
It's just a huge step.
It is. And we're seeing movements to extend the statute of limitations for civil claims, giving adult survivors more time to process their trauma. But here's where it gets really interesting for me. I compare it to treating a symptom while ignoring the disease.
How do you mean?
Well, yes, one music executive is currently in a low-security prison. But the true measure of success isn't his 50-month sentence. The real question is, has the machinery of the music industry actually been dismantled? We have this huge cultural reckoning happening, like everyone is talking about the Netflix docuseries produced by 50 Cent. But is the industry actually changing its DNA? Or did they just sacrifice one guy to protect the rest of the business?
That really is the defining tension of 2026, because institutional disassociation is easy, and honestly, it's cheap.
Yeah, it's just PR.
Right. We saw universities quickly strip the perpetrator of honorary degrees, and charter schools rush to remove his name from their buildings. That is purely public relations. Dismantling the machinery means something entirely different.
Everything it's financial changes.
Exactly. It means record labels fundamentally changing their payroll structures. It means firing the security teams, the assistants, and the fixers who facilitate and look the other way when abuse happens. The cultural reckoning on television is loud, but systemic change is slow, it's quiet, and it requires us to watch what these corporations do, not what they tweet.
Which means it requires us to keep paying attention to the victims, not the PR spin.
And that brings up a really important mirror we need to hold up to ourselves. When the Netflix documentaries drop, when the trial updates hit our social media feeds, how are we, as the public, consuming this? Are we treating the pain of Cassandra Ventura and Jane and Mia as just true crime entertainment? Or are we actually listening to the systemic warnings these survivors are giving us about how wealth and power insulate themselves from accountability?
That is exactly what I want you to sit with as we wrap up today's deep dive. Because the headlines love a spectacle. They love to focus on the private jets being grounded, the luxury mansions being raided, the dramatic downfall of a billionaire.
It gets the clicks.
It does, but that is just noise. The true center of gravity in this story, the only part that actually matters, is the immense, unbreakable strength of the women who stepped out of that fortress and spoke the truth.
Their courage forced an entire legal and cultural apparatus to finally confront its own complicity.
And their legacy is what we need to focus on. But I want to leave you with one final thought, something that wasn't in the courtroom transcripts but is looming right on the horizon for us. Think about the incredible difficulty these women faced just to prove what happened to them, fighting against paper NDAs and paid security guards.
It was a monumental fight.
Right. So if a music empire in 2025 could successfully use payroll and legal threats to hide physical violence for a decade, what happens tomorrow? What happens when these same corporate fortresses have access to advanced AI and deepfakes?
Oh, that is terrifying.
We are entering an era where powerful abusers won't just bury the surveillance tape. They will digitally alter it to gaslight the victims, the public, and the juries into believing the abuse never even happened. The machine of silence isn't dead. It is just upgrading its technology.
It's a chilling thought, yeah. And it underscores exactly why the truth has to be protected with such vigilance.
Which is why we have to remember who fought for that truth. Think about Cassandra Ventura. Think about Jane. Think about Mia and Dawn Richard and all the unnamed women whose stories we may never know. They didn't just win a civil settlement, and they didn't just secure a partial criminal conviction. What they actually did was shatter a blueprint of corporate-protected abuse that had worked flawlessly in the entertainment industry for decades.
They finally broke the mold.
They threw a wrench into the gears of the machine. So consider this. When the dust finally settles and the perpetrator's release date comes and goes, history should not remember this as the story of a music mogul's crimes. History must remember this as the exact moment a group of brave women forced an entire culture to finally look at the human cost of its entertainment.